Welcome to Conspiracist. Today, we're taking a focused look at the hypothesis that governments might have intentionally concealed evidence related to COVID-19 pandemic conspiracies.
Yes.
We've got a collection of research and reports here that really delve into the nature of these beliefs, where they came from, and our aim really is to objectively evaluate the reasoning, the evidence presented in these sources.
And I think it's important to begin by understanding why events like a pandemic, these huge, large-scale events, can become, well, fertile ground for conspiracy theories.
Okay.
Your sources indicate there's a pretty significant psychological element at play here when people experience a loss of control, during a crisis.
Which many people did.
Absolutely. There's a natural tendency to seek explanations that provide some sense of order, understanding. Conspiracy theories can offer that kind of framework, suggesting intentional actions behind events that might otherwise just feel chaotic, random.
So it's about finding a narrative that makes sense of it all, even if that narrative isn't maybe based on verifiable facts.
Precisely. One of the reports you provided highlights this human need for coherence. A conspiracy theory can kind of weave together different pieces of information, some real, some perceived, into what seems like a coherent story.
Right.
And that can be really appealing during times of high uncertainty when official explanations might be evolving or maybe lack complete clarity.
Your sources also make a clear distinction, it seems, between different types of COVID-19 conspiracy beliefs. Some seem to downplay the virus, while others claimed it was deliberately created. Can you elaborate on that divergence?
Yes, the research points to a whole spectrum of beliefs, really. On one end, you have theories suggesting the virus's severity was exaggerated, maybe for political reasons or economic purposes.
Okay.
These often question the motives behind, say, public health measures. Then on the other end, there were more, extreme claims, like the idea the virus was a manufactured bioweapon intentionally released for specific ends.
That's quite a leap.
It is. And interestingly, a study from early 2020 showed a significant portion of people in the U.S. Simultaneously believing the virus was man-made and that its threat was being exaggerated.
Wait, both at the same time? That doesn't sound very consistent.
Exactly. They aren't necessarily logically consistent viewpoints, but what they both reflect is this kind of distrust in official narratives.
It seems like the underlying thread here, then, is a skepticism towards established authorities, institutions.
That's absolutely a key element. It runs through so many conspiracy theories, a perceived lack of transparency or maybe inconsistencies in official communications. That can really fuel suspicion. It creates an opening for alternative explanations, regardless of their actual evidentiary basis.
Okay, let's pivot then to how these beliefs actually started and spread. The sources mention misinformation circulating very, very early in the pandemic. What were some of those initial themes?
Well, the reports indicate that as early as January 2020, we were already seeing the emergence of false health advice right alongside these conspiracy theories.
That early. Wow.
Yeah. Some early narratives included claims about the Purbright Institute, a research facility, being somehow connected to the outbreak. Then there was the idea that the virus was a bioweapon, and also that completely unfounded link to 5G technology. These theories gained traction online surprisingly quickly.
One of the reports uses this term reconfiguration to describe a lot of the misinformation. What exactly does that imply? What does reconfiguration mean here?
Reconfiguration, yeah. It suggests that existing pieces of information, some of which might even be factual in a totally different context, were being taken and, reinterpreted within a conspiratorial framework.
So
it wasn't always about creating something entirely new out of thin air. It was often more about twisting or spinning or just recontextualizing existing information to fit a particular narrative.
Which might make it seem more plausible, I guess, if it has kernels of something familiar.
Exactly. It incorporates familiar elements. And that same analysis points out that misinformation coming from prominent figures, though maybe less common overall, often had a really disproportionate impact.
Why is that?
Because of their platform.
Pretty much. When individuals with a large public platform, whether that's social media, politics, whatever, when they amplify a particular claim, it just inherently carries more weight. It reaches a much larger audience.
Right.
Their endorsement, even if it's based on totally unsubstantiated information, can lend credibility to the misinformation in the eyes of their followers, and it just accelerates its spread significantly.
Let's dig into some of the specific conspiracy theories then. The bioweapon claims, for instance, they seemed quite widespread. What do the sources actually suggest about those accusations?
Well, the sources detail accusations that the virus was engineered as a weapon by the United States. These were reported in places like Turkey and Iran.
Okay.
But at the same time, the lab leak theory, suggesting an accidental release from a Wuhan laboratory, also gained a lot of prominence.
Two competing ideas there.
Right. And it's important to note the WHO did conduct an investigation into the origins. Based on the evidence available at that time, they deemed a lab leak extremely unlikely.
But not impossible. Well, they acknowledged that further investigation couldn't definitively rule it out without more data. But that nuance, that uncertainty, was often lost in the broader, more heated discussion. Your sources also mention China's counter-narrative, suggesting a possible link between the U.S. military and the outbreak.
So we see these competing narratives emerging, often sort of fueled by geopolitical tensions, it sounds like.
That seems to be a factor, yes.
What about the theories that downplay the severity, the idea that it was all exaggerated? What was the reasoning there?
These theories often argued that the true danger of COVID-19 was being deliberately inflated. Maybe for political gain, maybe economic gain. Some suggested it was, no worse than a common flu. Others posited more sinister motives behind the perceived exaggeration.
And the consequence of that belief?
Well, that kind of belief could lead individuals to disregard public health guidelines, underestimate the risks associated with the virus.
Okay. The connection between 5G technology and the pandemic was another really notable one. What can you tell us about its origins and impact based on the sources?
Yeah, the 5G theory. It falsely claimed that this wireless communication technology either spread the virus directly or somehow weakened people's immune systems, making them more susceptible.
Which has no scientific basis.
None whatsoever. It completely lacks scientific basis, yet unfortunately it led to real-world consequences, including suspected arson attacks on telecommunications infrastructure in some regions.
Really? Actual attacks?
Yes. It highlights the potential for misinformation, even seemingly bizarre misinformation, to incite tangible harm.
Wow. Your sources also touch on claims surrounding PCR testing. What were the main arguments in those conspiracy theories?
The central claim there was essentially that PCR testing for COVID-19 was fraudulent or unreliable.
How so?
Well, these theories often question the accuracy of the tests. They suggested they were being used to artificially inflate case numbers, perhaps to justify lockdowns or other measures.
But the scientific view?
The scientific consensus remains that RT-PCR is a highly sensitive and accurate method for detecting the virus's genetic material. It was, and is, a crucial tool in diagnosing infections throughout the pandemic. The gold standard, really.
Got it. There were also some, rather unusual claims based on misinterpreted data, like the one about sulfur dioxide releases in China. What's the background there?
Ah, yes, that one. This theory came from a misinterpretation of NASA satellite data showing fluctuations in sulfur dioxide levels over China.
Okay.
Conspiracy theorists falsely linked these fluctuations to increased crematorium activity. They suggested a far, far higher death toll than was being officially reported.
But that wasn't the case.
No. It was debunked by experts who explained the data actually related to things like industrial emissions, weather patterns, other factors. Nothing to do with human remains on that scale.
Another claim involved a supposed decline in cell phone subscriptions in China being linked to mass COVID-19 deaths. What's the reality behind that one?
Right, the cell phone subscription theory. The decrease that was observed in China during a certain period. Well, it was likely due to a combination of economic factors and social disruptions caused by the pandemic itself.
Like people losing jobs or moving.
Exactly. People might have canceled secondary phone lines or faced financial hardship leading to service termination. Attributing this drop directly to millions of unrecorded COVID-19 deaths was a huge speculative leap. There was just no supporting evidence for that connection.
It seems even academic work, or what looked like it, got caught up in this, like that retracted article from Johns Hopkins University. What happened there?
Yes, that was an interesting case. A student-run publication associated with Johns Hopkins published an article that inaccurately claimed there was no evidence of excess deaths due to COVID-19.
Which wasn't true.
Which was demonstrably false based on mortality data.
Yeah.
The article was quickly retracted by the university because of its significant inaccuracies and flawed methodology. But unfortunately, before the retraction, it was seized upon by conspiracy theorists.
And used as proof.
Exactly. Used to support claims that the pandemic's impact was being wildly exaggerated.
The sources also point to misinformation campaigns targeting specific regions, like Taiwan. What were the key narratives being pushed there?
Reports from Taiwan indicated a fairly coordinated effort to spread misinformation, particularly on social media platforms like Facebook.
I'm like, what?
Suggesting that the pandemic was actually out of control on the island and that the government was actively covering it up.
And the suspected origin?
There were strong suspicions, mentioned in the reports, that these campaigns originated from mainland China, potentially as a way to undermine public trust in the Taiwanese government and its handling of the situation.
And then there were theories about the virus being present much, much earlier than initially believed, like those herd immunity claims in California in 2019.
Right, the idea that COVID-19 might have been circulating undetected, maybe in California, in late 2019, potentially leading to some kind of early herd immunity. That theory did gain some traction for a while.
But it didn't hold up.
No. Subsequent genetic analyses of early virus samples, plus antibody studies, indicated that the virus was most likely first introduced to the U.S. in January 2020, at the earliest. That effectively debunked the earlier circulation theory.
And, of course, alongside all this, there were just numerous false claims about how the virus actually spreads and so-called cures.
Oh, absolutely. Baseless claims about transmission.
Yeah.
Things like it's spreading through mosquitoes or maybe contaminated objects, like I think one example is Costco toilet paper. Just totally unfounded stuff circulated widely.
Right.
And at the same time, you had numerous unproven, sometimes potentially harmful remedies being promoted. Everything from silver-infused toothpaste to dangerously bleach consumption. And, of course, the use of ivermectin.
Ivermectin was a big one.
It was. And it's really crucial to note that major health organizations, the WHO, the FDA, European agencies have consistently advised against using ivermectin for COVID-19 outside of properly controlled clinical trials.
Right.
There's just been a lack of solid evidence for its efficacy, and there are potential harms.
The Plandemic film is also mentioned in your sources. What role did that play in shaping these kinds of beliefs?
Plandemic. Yes. That was a very significant piece of disinformation. It presented a whole range of false and misleading claims about the virus's origins, the motives behind public health measures. It alleged involvement of various individuals and institutions in some kind of pre-planned pandemic scenario.
And its effect.
It explicitly encouraged viewers to distrust mainstream sources, doctors, scientists, and to conduct their own research, which in practice often meant leading them down these rabbit holes filled with unsubstantiated conspiracy theories.
Right. And finally, there's a more recent one mentioned, the air vaccine conspiracy theory. What does your research tell us about that?
The air vaccine theory.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's a baseless claim. It suggests that inhalable mRNA vaccines, sometimes linked conspiratorially to Bill Gates, have been secretly approved and are being administered without people's knowledge or consent, through the air somehow.
Which is not happening.
No. It completely misrepresents legitimate, ongoing research into alternative vaccine delivery methods, like nasal sprays, but twists it into this sinister, secret plot. It lacks any factual basis whatsoever.
It's really clear from everything we've discussed that the landscape of COVID-19 conspiracy theories is just vast and varied. What does your analysis suggest about the individuals and groups involved in spreading these beliefs?
Well, the spread definitely wasn't confined to any single group. Your sources point to the involvement of a really diverse range of actors.
Like who?
Politicians, sometimes seeking to frame the narrative to their advantage. Celebrities, social media influencers with huge followings, and even allegedly state-sponsored disinformation campaigns.
State-sponsored.
Yes, there have been reports suggesting coordinated efforts by some countries to spread particular narratives, maybe about the virus's origins or the effectiveness of different vaccines or responses. For instance, one report detailed a covert Pentagon campaign, apparently aimed at undermining China's vaccine efforts in certain regions, particularly the Philippines.
So motivations varied widely. Political gain, ideological agendas.
Exactly. A whole mix of motivations seem to be at play.
One of the reports you shared also highlights the role of confirmation bias, how that makes people susceptible to these theories. Can you explain that connection?
Confirmation bias is a really powerful cognitive tendency we all have, to some extent. It's where individuals tend to favor information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses.
And ignore things that contradict them.
Right. They disregard or downplay contradictory information.
Yeah.
So if someone already harbors, say, a deep distrust towards government or scientific institutions, they're much more likely to accept and believe a conspiracy theory that aligns with that pre-existing skepticism, even if the evidence supporting the theory is weak or non-existent.
Makes sense. You gravitate towards what fits your worldview.
Precisely. Interestingly, some research suggests that simply raising awareness of confirmation bias, making people conscious of it, can potentially help them become more critical consumers of information.
That's hopeful. Given the sheer scale and variety of misinformation we've talked about, what are some of the key challenges in trying to address it effectively? It seems overwhelming.
It is a huge challenge. Combating this infodemic, as the WHO called it, presents multiple difficulties. First, just the sheer volume of information being generated and spread online makes it incredibly difficult to track, let alone debunk, every false claim.
It's like whack-a-mole.
Kind of, yeah. And the speed at which misinformation can spread through social media platforms just exacerbates the issue enormously. Things go viral before they can be properly assessed.
And then there's the moderation issue.
Exactly. The challenge of content moderation. Deciding what constitutes harmful misinformation, how to address it without infringing on principles of free speech. That's a really complex and ongoing debate with no easy answers.
So wrapping up this deep dive, looking into the hypothesis of government concealment around COVID-19 conspiracies, it really reveals this complex web. Psychological factors, misinterpreted information, and yes, some deliberate disinformation too.
Absolutely.
Right.
And while that desire for understandable explanations, for a sense of order during a crisis, is a completely natural human response,
Yeah.
our examination of the available sources really underscores the prevalence of unsubstantiated claims and the very diverse origins and methods used to spread them.
The research and reports we've discussed today, they really emphasize the critical importance of, well, cultivating critical thinking skills, promoting media literacy, and just fostering an awareness of our own cognitive biases, like confirmation bias, when we navigate information, especially during times of uncertainty.
That distinction between factual evidence and speculative conjecture. It remains absolutely paramount in trying to understand significant global events like this pandemic.
So as you, our listeners, continue to consider the vast amount of information surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic and all the various narratives that have emerged, we really encourage you to reflect on the underlying motivations behind these beliefs and to critically evaluate the evidence, or maybe the lack thereof, that supports them.
Yeah, understanding why such widespread conspiracy theories take hold, it has really significant implications for public health, for trust in institutions moving forward. It's a question worth further reflection.
This whole exploration just highlights the need for ongoing efforts, doesn't it? To build resilience against misinformation and foster a more informed, more discerning public.
Recognizing the psychological drivers, the methods of dissemination, that's a crucial step, I think, in navigating whatever information landscapes we face in the future.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.